Hi, everyone. Welcome to this BAFTA Online Masterclass. We're here at Riot Games. I'm Chris Tom. I'm going to be hosting. We have lower thirds and titles. Cool. I'm here with Laura, Greg, and Ariel. We're going to be talking about designing champions in League of Legends and kind of through this process that we affectionately call DNA, which is pretty straightforward: design, narrative, art.
Notice design comes first.
Ooh. Could be.
It doesn't.
Well, all right, we're starting on spicy. Let's do this. It is the glorious unification and collaborative, process by which we create champions. Obviously, we have some opinions as to what is the most strongest pillar here. Quick summary also for anyone who is wondering about this stream in and of itself. Basically, BAFTA is a big global network of about 7,000 films, games, television professionals, and this stream is part of a new series of spotlighted, nominated, spotlight, there you go, spotlight nominated talents. So we're gonna kick this off then talking about DNA champion design. Quickly before we get into it, we have a lot of, we call them disciplines: design, narrative, and art. I'm kind of curious, are there things or projects that have been kicked off at Riot that have been, you think, in your, have been led primarily by your disciplines? And just an example of that so that our viewers can get an idea of how we work here. So I'll start with you, Laura.
Oh, okay. I don't know if I would say, when you say led by our discipline.
Or maybe,
but I'm
like
gonna talk a little bit about maybe a project that the discipline was very passionate about that just happened this year. That I think that they had a big hand in making it successful, and that was the development of Zaya and Rakan. And so Zoey and Rakan were really special champions for us because we had, so even backing up from there, their internal sort of code name was Duo.
Right.
So right from the beginning, they were going to be these champions that were in one way or another a couple. So that's a super interesting challenge to the art team because first of all, you want to make these champions look like they fit together, but you don't want them to look so related that you can't tell them apart from a gameplay perspective, and they don't both have a very unique personality.
Right.
So for us, Zaya and Rakan were super interesting project to kind of sink our teeth into because that's what we're trying to balance. So for example, Zaya and Rakan, the way they were developed, we ended up developing a new race. Right, so they're both from Ionia, so they're the same race and they're from Ionia, so they have a lot of the same shape language. Ionia has this kind of Art Nouveau shape language. So right away you're like, okay, visually they look like they're from the same place. They look like they're connected. But then there was the, hey, how do we also make sure that their personalities are separate? And so you can see that in things like the way we treated their color palette. Color palette is very warm, a very Ionian color palette for Rakan, which also represents his personality because Rakan is like super flamboyant.
Super bombastic.
Yeah, he lives in the now. He's all like, he loves life. He has a real zest for life. And Zaya, we ended up pushing the color palette in this place that was colder. She's kind of these purples and pinks, but still very warm. And for us, that really represented that Zaya she's more serious, she has a purpose, and she's laser focused on that purpose. So that's just kind of an example of, and by the way, I bring up the color palette because we went back and forth about this, which is like keeping her in a warm realm but being cool so that they would still look like when they stood side by side that they were together but they were different. And also even in their animations where I think that the art team got to play so much in representing that they were a couple. And if you guys know they have that dance that they do. If you have them in lane together, they do this really beautiful dance. And in their recall, I think their recall is so charming. Like he dips her, you get the sense that they're having this moment together and that they're a couple. So the team took as many opportunities as they could to give them those moments to communicate that they were together and they were in love and they were a couple, but then also made sure that they had enough special animations and special stylization so they could stand apart as two unique personalities.
Very cool. Greg, design?
The example that immediately came to mind was runes. It's a huge feature we just launched. I would say that was really, we were trying to solve a design problem with runes.
Yeah.
We quickly had to get engineers and artists and other folks involved to get that project out the door because its scope is huge. Probably less so in the narrative compared to some of our projects. But we weren't trying to solve necessarily an art problem with runes. It was a design problem. The space was not interesting for players to play in, and we thought there were huge opportunities there.
Right.
For narrative, we just kind of completed the first part of what's a much longer process, but going through our
Much longer process.
back catalog of like 139 champions and looking at their short biographies that are on the client. And when we did that, we saw that they were all over the place from varying years of production. I mean, League's been in production for a long time.
Yeah.
So we might have had like some champions had 2 sentences, some champions had full stories. And we wanted to make the experience in the client for every player to be somewhat similar, predictable when it came to understanding what that champion was about in a short, digestible piece. And then now that we have Universe, we actually have a place to put a lot of our longer content that we didn't have to store all those stories in the client.
Yeah.
So we had to go through each and every champion and kind of distill who they were down to about 80 or 100 words, kind of get that across the board for all of our localized languages, so it was a consistent experience. And now we can actually go through the much longer process of going through their long bios and their color stories and their short stories and making sure that it's all cohesive. But it was a pretty extensive process to just go through and kind of digest characters who weren't up for a champ update or hadn't had their narrative information looked at in a little while, and just kind of do a kind of a tidying up, also knowing what some things are going on down the line for League and for other projects.
Especially when you have like 140 characters that, let's say 8-9 years ago, were created just sort of like, we need this thing over here.
Just trying to zero in on what made them special, and trying to be as conscious as we possibly can of the meta that players have put together when there's been a lack of information, trying to appreciate that, and also trying to find them a more cohesive, coherent home in our IP, like giving them a place in our world and a connection to the world, and then like doing that in 100 words. It was a tall order, but we're really it's the beginning, it's the climb up the mountain. So we're at base.
There's a bit of triage there, right? Because some of them are good, some of them can be good at a little work, and some of them are like, this is needs a complete redo.
And I think that we definitely wanted to read through all the bios and players' understandings of what those champions were, especially if we didn't have the luxury of going back and changing design or adding additional VO or changing their art.
You can only do it in a story almost.
So it's like, what is the truth about this character and what potentially doesn't negate all the things that are out there in the world, and making sure that that's clear. And then hopefully we will be getting some connection more to the client and Universe to make that transition easier to find more information. But we just wanted it to be so that every champ had a more consistent.
Right. I guess that's a cool segue into what we're talking about, DNA, like especially when you're looking through some of the stories of like our way old champions. You have something like a Yordle and a Mech, and we way back I think we're approaching design in a whole lot of different ways and design new champions. Sometimes it's fly by the seat of your pants. We need a champion in 2 weeks. Make something, please. And so let's bring this over to the concept of DNA. This is a not relatively new process, maybe a couple of years now. We've been going through a lot of iterations of what DNA means, but I'm curious, have we always worked this way? Or when you think about the way past, what has driven champion development for League of Legends?
I mean, we were talking about this a little bit ago, trying to figure out when it started, and I think we agreed it was between Quinn and Braum. Like after Quinn, we're like, we need a process. Like we can't just keep throwing champions out there. And Braum, I think, was the first, which is 3-ish years ago, was the first time we let's put a representative from these 3 disciplines together and see if they can collaborate to come up with something really cool.
And to that point, like, is that how the process now, talking about DNA, starts? Like you just get 3 people into a room and then you shake it all around for 6 hours?
It's probably a little longer than 6 hours.
Oh, wow.
So like the baking process.
I was going really far, but okay.
Do they get lunch breaks?
No, it's just, like they don't get out until you have a champion.
One token,
No, so when we start with DNA on League, when we're making new champions, we'll start with what we call an opportunity space. And that opportunity space can come from any one of the disciplines, whether or not it's a design question like, what have we done something new in the jungle? Can we introduce a new play pattern? It might come from art where, what does a druid look like in our game, or it might come from narrative. Like what is the personality of a dragon we've promised our players for a really long time, and exploring those spaces. So we start with that opportunity space, and we go into a phase called discovery, and that's usually a narrative writer, a game designer, and usually a concept artist as the art component, with a product owner who's going to kind of help shepherd, make sure that we're on task, and a DM to kind of keep us seeing the end horizon, a delivery manager, so a scheduler kind of person. And we start talking about what that opportunity space could be. And those discussions can go all over the place. We can talk about what's hot in the meta, like when we think of this opportunity space, what are we excited about? And we get a ton of ideas to start with in that space. We'll make mood boards and champion pillars and just conversations, and it's usually about a month's worth of time of meeting once or twice a week, where we talk and discuss and bring in those collages of either art or words or paper design kits, where things kind of start to take shape.
Right.
And then once we've kind of gotten to a couple of archetypes, or maybe a single archetype, either in design or in art or in narrative, we may pass into a phase called ideation, where we kind of drill down creatively and explore all the different possibilities that are specific to maybe that archetype.
This is a long phase.
Yeah. Discovery is about 4 weeks, and we'll get more ideas from the team, because all that stuff will start to circulate outside of our pods, in the halls and league, the whisperings of like, oh, a new champion's starting,
right.
and
creative overflow.
So you get a lot of different ideas.
Well, they even post their stuff. Like, have that in that hallway. They start posting up all their discovery work, so people can walk by and see it.
I love walking by and seeing this stuff.
Yeah, you can see all the stages. Yeah.
Yeah. So once we go into ideation, then we start trying to figure out like who that particular version of that archetype is, and how do they fit potentially in our world. And we'll start talking about things like voice, and thinking about like who we might want them to sound like. We might talk about silhouette, or different evolutions of a single archetype, whether or not that like, do we want to make a tree druid, or maybe like a water druid, or like where does that what does each one of those things do as a function of gameplay that is fun. So I think a lot of that stuff is even though we might think of some really cool narrative or art ideas, if the heart and soul of the gameplay is not fun, then
it's a game at the end of the day.
Nobody's going to play the game.
Right.
So, yeah.
This could be a super beautiful champion that does, okay.
Yeah.
I guess more recent than examples, we just recently released Zoey, who is, I think, in a lot of ways, pushing a lot of our boundaries in terms of artistic.
And pushing players' boundaries.
Yeah, pushing players' boundaries.
Pushing writers' boundaries, players' boundaries.
Yeah.
Everybody's boundaries are getting pushed.
Playing against Zoey, I get, but let's talk a little bit about that. Like Zoey, how she came to be. I think visually she's just very striking, and so I'm kind of curious, like your favorite Zoey stories, or just like her origin story, and how everyone worked together.
Okay, so Zoey, every memory I have of us developing Zoey has to do with a lot of internal feedback, because I think that we can admit that we're pretty comfortable making the kind of like tough guy or assassin or darker character. And by the way, me included, like I like Callista's one of my favorite thematics, so I'm not excluding myself from that. And I think that when we started thinking about Zoey, the team felt that we were missing that bubbly, fun, really happy, colorful champion in the mid lane, some champion that'd be reminiscent of Lux. And that we were long overdue for that, and that our players really wanted that. So Zoey went through a lot of different iterations, but she was always young, and she kind of got younger as it went on. And there was this feeling that what would be so fun is to have this small girl. That's the form she's chosen. She's a small girl, but she's actually, she's actually, I know, because I was using my hands a lot. She's actually an ancient, powerful being. And for the team, that was a big challenge. And one of the things that was challenging about it is that, I love to tell the story of Rory, one of the animators, went over to his desk and he was like, I don't know how to make, I don't know a little girl power fantasy. Like, how do I do a little girl power fantasy? I'm lost. He's like, when I go home my free time, I'm doing like ninjas with swords and stuff. This is really what Rory said.
Right.
And Jem and I started joking that we're going to buy tutus for all the animators so they could like, get in touch
Really?
with it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like you got to get in touch with the little girl. But they did do a lot of research and they did watch, they watched, I can't remember which movie they watched, it was a little girl dancing, and looked for a lot of inspiration out there because they definitely wanted her to feel like she was powerful and that she's having a blast, but that she can go toe-to-toe with Zed.
Right.
And that this is something she chooses, right? That's
Right.
If you ever get a chance to play with her against Aurelian Soul, she talks to him like he's an angsty teenager. She's
This guy who can blow up universes.
Yes. Yeah. But I'll tell you, artistically, getting her there, I will say we often would go past what we'd call like the line. We'd push it pretty far and then we'd rein it back in. So there would be areas, for example, that I think were quite a bit of debate was around breaking the fourth wall. Giving her a jumping rope, giving her a yo-yo, that would be breaking the fourth wall. But we really felt like she had to have toys. So what that became was, okay, she's this, cosmic being, so she builds her toys out of the constellations, right? She can just pull the stars out of the air, and she can form this beautiful jump rope, and she can just skip all over the rift.
Right.
So this was some of the push and pull, but I think in the end, where we landed, I would say internally, there's still debate over whether or not we went too far as her colorful bubbliness, but for us, I would say, for many of us, we don't feel that way. We think she absolutely belongs in our world. And personally, I'm really happy if we are still having debates on the floor about whether or not a champion went too far with their thematics, because that means that we're still trying to do new things. We're still pushing and we're keeping it fresh.
Right.
But certainly from our players, we had a reflection of that feedback where we have people who were incredibly enthusiastic about her, like, I can't believe you guys did that.
Very polarizing.
And then people who are like, what is going on with this rainbow girl? Right. So we're kind of seeing both those things.
To that note, like every character that we put into the universe, they sort of stretch the spectrum of what's kind of capable and the types of characters that can exist. And I think we have done a lot of grimdark in the past couple of years, especially. The narrative team is set down with this thing of like Zoey. We are creating a very fun little girl power fantasy in this universe where you have gods just raging at each other. How does the narrative team work with that?
Well, I think so when Zoey first started in her DNA process, I think a lot of the gameplay that was starting to rise up was this the portal trickster gameplay, being in different places. And so in narrative, what we like to do is take that gameplay, either the emotion or like the actual gameplay itself, and kind of look for an archetype in literature or just in history, mythology of like what that could represent. So for Zoey, we went way back for like Trickster. So Trickster, and I think that's actually one of her thematic pillars. I don't remember exactly the words for it, but
that one might have been like I think her working name at some point.
Yeah, well, I think her working name it was Trickster.
Early on, it was like Portal Mage or Mirror Mage, and then
Mirror
we backed
Mage.
off the portals a little bit. It went more for like the Trickster that she's kind of having fun with you.
So I think looking back, if you look at tricksters in like mythology, so you have like Coyote or Loki or Hermes or Peter Pan, just as in terms of like what they do in story is they're these heralds of change, and they know something you might not about the other world. And I think of all of those places to try and find a home for her, Targon actually was a really appropriate place because it knows a lot more about the world than Runeterra. It has that kind of immortal aspect to it. But in turn, looking at those archetypes and seeing kind of like if this is a herald of change and that it's kind of meant to kind of bend your perception of reality, then what better representation of that to kind of turn like maybe like a male-centered trickster into like a little girl. And I think Zoe is interesting because she's in this kind of preteen space where she's not quite a kid, like she's
Annie.
like Annie, but she's also not a full adult. So she still has this very playful attitude, but she carries this responsibility of information of like bringing change to your world and potential, disaster.
She'll do it, but like over a long period of time.
Yeah, and the message might be a little mixed in terms of what she's actually going to tell you. But that informed her kind of like playful approach in VO. That when we were seeing the animation studies of her skipping and jumping, like all of those pieces. I mean, that's what the DNA process is like. This evolution from all the different disciplines to kind of put their piece in and see how it gets shaped by the sum of the parts.
You're making like a stew, basically.
Yes, so,
people just dumping their stuff in.
So if somebody gets excited and they're like, I think she should have a jump rope, and then it kind of gets everybody else excited, and everybody puts their piece back into the puzzle until you step back and you're like, holy shit, this is awesome champion.
We made a stew.
Yeah,
I feel like people got very
glittery
excited.
stew.
Yeah, like people got very excited with her too. I think particularly again the animators were super excited. I think they started out nervous, and they were able to do facial animation, which is not something that they normally do.
Yeah.
Because her head is big.
Yeah.
You know, to make a
Super
little girl
expressive.
look like a little girl, she has to have kind of a. We have to push some of the proportions so that she reads with the camera, and so her head's a bit bigger. So the animators wanted to give her a lot of facial expressions, and again, really communicate that she's having a great time out there in the mid lane. And I know that they added, the extra walk cycle. A lot of this was just based on the enthusiasm of the team and them feeling like this is what a little girl wouldn't walk the same way every time. Like she's going to run and she's going to skip rope. And I know at one point the question was, well, hey, if we do all this, are players ever going to find it? And they were like, if you love Zoey, you're playing this little girl, you will find that. You will find that. And
after 100, 200 games, whatever.
I think you'll find it right away, because I think it really fits her personality. You almost expect it. Like you just don't expect her to be able to sit still. Right. So anyway.
To that note, I think you were mentioning this. She started out as a portal mage.
Yeah.
But now when you look at her, the portal is iconic, but
still there. Yeah.
But her paddle star is like this very and the trouble ball, probably for people who get hit by it, is probably most of
well, and the summoner spell stealing.
Yeah, she's actually a lot of things now that you think about it. But how did she, design-wise, was design in that room where they we have this great idea, let's all start running toward it, or how do you think design really fit into this?
Well, Brad, who's the designer, felt like this was a big challenge for him because we have a lot of mages, and he felt like we really had to do something different and special with her.
Right.
With Zai and Rakan, for example, they're a duo champion. That's kind of their identity. So even though their abilities are not, I would say extreme overall, their identity is wrapped up in the fact that they're a duo.
Right.
And that's something that players could wrap their heads around.
Narratively led in that sense. Yeah.
But with Zoey, the design really felt like, okay, we've got to do something players have never seen before. And for a while, every ability was something players had never seen before. I feel like we backed off the E the most. Originally, it was like this crazy bouncing shot that you had to get really skilled at managing where the bounce was going to be. And through play testing and just talking about it, we're like, okay, we really need to decide what is she about. Is it the Q? Is it the summoner spells? And so we ended up backing off that a little bit. There's still the sleepy aspect of it, but it's much easier to land. She's a very high skill, very high mechanic champion.
It's crazy because when I look at her, I think, oh yeah, I can totally play this. And then I just press Q once, and I'm like, what button should I press? And I flash into them, and I die. I'm like, okay, none of these things. Yeah, not that button.
Yeah.
But to that point, then, how does the kit evolution also, does it end up tanking or kind of slowing down? Let's say if narrative and art says, we have an idea, we're driving on this, and kit comes back and says, we've backed off of this crazy bouncing E. We're now all about the paddle star, and we're less about the portals.
I think that because, so after our ideation process, before we started, we go into a phase called pre-production before we go into full production, and we answer a lot of questions that come from testing that you can only get when you put it in players' hands and figure out whether or not it's fun. So in that stage, we're also doing a lot of narrative and artwork to finalize character models and stuff, so we can be more flexible in those stages before we start jumping in and making production. But I think for Zoey's case, and it's a good example of we understood that Zoey was going to be a high skill champion, that she was going to be hard to play, and her VO is intentionally not going to try and tilt you as you learn her skills. So
that's cool. Yeah.
She has lines for when she misses skill shots, but to kind of echo some of that frustration and maybe make you smile a little bit while you're doing it, so that it's just not as soul crushing when you miss all of your skill shots.
Yeah.
So, and I think that idea of because VO is probably the best expression of narrative in League of Legends proper, but that is an opportunity for us to either reinforce gameplay emotions or feelings, or kind of temper them if you're in a high stress situation. Also to inform character, to call attention to things and that's how characters kind of show up in League narratively. For the Rakan example, he's this flamboyant peacock. his gameplay role is to take the fire off of his ADC, and so his VO is meant to kind of tilt the other person in the lane and draw fire to him, and he's written that way, you know, and I think that's like as designed from a narrative perspective. So I think
it's everything about how he looks too, and how he struts.
Yeah,
right?
Draw the eye.
Everything,
All of those
everything
things.
was meant to draw the eye. Yeah,
it's interesting because you talk about how in a game, we're kind of talking about the work that goes into the game, but then when you're in the game, a lot of it is gameplay first, almost like you're just trying to enjoy this PvP game mode, and so the different disciplines, particularly I think narrative and art, you have to figure out how do we get into there without obstructing the play. Right, and so narrative is like VO. I know when you're playing Zoey and Rakan, they talk nonstop to each other,
Yes.
And then they talk to the enemy, and they do a lot of crazy stuff. In terms of art, then, how do you like? You've talked a little bit about this in previous discussions, but like art supporting gameplay, and I'm curious, especially in terms of Zoey, like how did you get into how do you get into this mentality, and what do you tell your artists when they're sometimes going like off the rails, let's say, with like art and animation? They're like, we can do so
That
much.
never happens.
Oh yeah, and they never
It
get
does.
reined in. Oh okay.
yeah, we definitely.
Yeah.
We can. Yeah, so I think that the way we do this, I mean, we we have a process, right? We review very often. We review with what we call our stakeholders, right? We review with people outside of the team. We review within the team as well.
We play test a lot.
We play test a lot, and we're all asked on the team to play test. Like I'm not personally making Zoey, but I am play testing her. And I think that we have a very open feedback culture, so we have a way of giving feedback. But we also do something I think that we didn't do in the past, which was important, which is we do define our pillars. Like, what is the core of this champion, so that when we start to deviate away from that, we bring it back to that. So it's not going to be about, hey, I have all this feedback, like everybody's saying all these things to me, what do I do? Or I really believe in this particular direction, and I want to take Zoey, and I want her to be, all of her VFX to be incredibly bubbly. Actually, a good example is very bubbly, and almost at one point looked a little bit like an 80s arcade. And what we did is we went back and looked at the pillars. We're like, hey, she was supposed to be this cosmic godlike creature. You know, let's make sure that those stars feel like constellations. Let's make sure that it's understood that her hair is her power source, and it has this twilight feeling to it. She's supposed to be this twilight child. So that's what we usually do, is we go back to those original pillars that we agreed on. I'm not saying we never change those. Because
or that we always nail it.
Yeah, we don't always nail it.
Right.
But we do need to have some type of North Star so that we can make the right decisions when all the feedback's coming in, and we make sure that the things that we're losing are the things that are beginning to take us away what was supposed to be core about this champion. But then, of course, we keep all the feedback and all the things that are helping us drive towards that.
Right.
Yeah.
Two things. One is we're taking questions now, I think, at this point in time. So you guys can throw any of your questions into the stream, and then for the last 15 minutes, so in about 15 minutes, we'll start answering them. Hopefully they're good questions. And I'm holding you guys accountable. So we're going to keep going on this, though. I think there's another side of it, though, where we're talking about these are the pillars, and this is how we create a champion through the DNA process. Have we ever had times, like let's say outside of Zoey or Zion or Khan, where let's say someone has just kind of got that spark and taken off, and we've, I think, been narrative, like we call it like narratively driven or design driven or art driven. What tends to be the most, I wouldn't say dominant like pillar, but the usual one that leads in that sense?
I think now we're actually getting to the point where we want that to be a much more equal discussion. I think a lot of times the space that we kind of jump into of like, wouldn't it be fun, would probably start with design, because we just need a kit is something that we can build around, you know, whether or not that's an emotion or there's a technical aspect, like we need the model to be able to do a certain thing, or like that's a good space to start asking questions. But I think that as we get just past that, it really has to be supported by all of the disciplines, because it's that stew that we make together that is the secret sauce. Like that's the thing, is that the collaboration and everybody kind of bringing their skills from their own individual craft, whether or not that's like animation or narrative writing or game design or engineering, like all those things have to go into the mix for a really great standout champion to kind of come out. So if one discipline starts to push harder than the others, it can like just kind of upset that balance a little bit. And usually it's kind of found and kind of brought, everybody brings back and sees, you know, like what their questions could add to that.
Right.
Like Kane is an example, I think, that was heavily driven by design. The idea was, hey, we want a champion that transforms and is one champion and then kind of forks into one or the other. Whereas Jinx is an example, I think, where the artist had a great image and everyone's like, yes, let's make that champion.
Yeah.
Right. And I remember talking to August about that. And he was saying that he had started just recently. It was like Vi and Jinx were the two that he was really enthusiastic about. I remember he was like, he saw the art for Jinx and he just kind of took off. And it might have been art-led in the beginning, but when they started really working on it, he was so like deep in that stew that he could really have kits that bounced off of the art, and the art could kind of like feed it as well.
That's one of his superpowers. Is August is really good at making the mechanics match the thematic. So you look at like Jinx's passive is all about, I need to be more and more and more reckless and take chances, and kind of the crazier I get, I'm encouraged to get even more crazy.
Right. It's interesting. Like, do different narrative writers, artists, and designers, they work differently in terms of like how, not collaborative, but I guess like how they contribute to that stew. Like I think we've, especially in terms of artists, like you have some artists who lead the way with concept art and they just constantly bounce things off each other, or they wait to hear the kit and they come back with almost something that is perfect for it. Do you have to kind of deploy the artists differently depending on how they work with these things? And then have you ever like seen a champion where you're like, oh, actually, you know what, this artist would get super inspired here?
Yeah, we definitely think about where an artist, like what type of champion an artist would be inspired by. But as far as deploy, I would say the way our teams work is like if there's an artist that's very passionate about a champion, it's pretty hard to pull them away from it. Okay?
They'll just gravitate.
Yeah, if you could, I'm sure you're thinking of some of the personalities we have on the team who get like really excited about a champion, and it's not like I think that people will jump in or want to be a part of a champion's development if it's a champion that really resonates with them. So I wouldn't say we have a particular mode of deployment. I think we try to be, I think we try to make sure that we always have the people that are really passionate about the work, working on the work, and if they can't actually be hands-on, they're still going to be asked to give feedback or be a part of it in some other way. Yeah.
Cool, okay. Are we close to questions-ish? Yeah, okay, cool. Because I want to give time for the questions, and we have a decent amount of them. Sweet. We're just getting even more pasted in. All right, let's get to questions then. So, do you think, from an art perspective, Riot will one day overcome Elementalist Lux? Oh, that's interesting.
Overcome her awesomeness or overcome her baggage?
Yeah, I don't know which one. I'm going to assume they mean like do more than Elementalist Lux, considering that we went
like
so
35 forms.
Elementalist Lux? I see. Okay. Yeah, actually, that's I guess an interesting question. When you look at how much she is, what do you? I guess in terms of Elementalist Lux and what she's brought, what do you think that she's done really well, or what do you think that we could learn from her that we want to be?
I think Elementalist Lux is a super interesting skin because the team was incredibly ambitious with her skin. And I think that as far as all of the artistic ambitions, like everything that they wanted to do, they did it. I think that some of the downsides with Elementalist Lux is like a feedback we've been given is that she can be a little bit confusing and lame, like especially when we first released her. People didn't quite understand how many forms she had. And
she keeps coming back a different champion.
Yeah, they kind of lose track. They had a lot of panic moments, like, who's that coming out? Oh, okay, it's my teammate. They had a lot of these, they had some of these moments with her. So I think that there's always a possibility that we would do something like as ambitious artistically as Elementalist Lux. I don't know if we would do it exactly the same way as we did Elementalist Lux. And I think that would all depend on what the opportunity was there. It's like what was the opportunity for a particular champion? What did we hear that players are excited about and that they would like to have? So I could never say no to that. I think my answer would be yes, but I don't think it would be quite the same way. I don't know if it's
35
about
forms.
it might not be about the amount of content and how many forms. It might take on a different shape, but be equally ambitious.
To that note, I imagine that the DNA pillars obviously don't quite apply in skin development, but we do have to have some degree of balance in like either design clarity or narrative, like the worlds that these little micro worlds that we're building.
I just came off a long stint on Skins, so
Okay, yeah.
having,
So you can speak
having
directly to it,
so
yeah.
like it's actually this is an amazing world in that it is taking the champion and that distillation of character, or like who they are, and really trying to kind of imagine what their karmic evolution is in a different alternate fantasy. So we can't really do sci-fi in our kind of epic fantasy normal like league base IP kind of thing. But if we wanted to do that in Project or Super Galaxy, or find out explore relationships between characters that might not necessarily have met in a magical girl fantasy or any of those things. But to do that, we really have to understand who the character is to make sure that they are represented, and that when you see them, artistically, design-wise, their kit usually won't change unless they have some evolutions in their like an ultimate form. And then narratively, like, is that the same character? Or
But
show me
reimagined,
show me a different side of that same character.
Yeah.
Like just seeing how much you can push them while still being recognizable. So it's a really fun space to play in. So I really like that we have that aspect of League, that we can just go off and see what that is and have a good time doing it.
Interesting. Champion reworks is the next question. Like, which champion or champions have stood out as needing the most time in the rework oven? And I think also I think to your point, when you were doing the narrative overhaul of 140 champions, I'm sure that there was these little moments where you're like, wow, this champion just is very hollow. Have you?
Zillion, I think, is a
okay, immediately, we got
a lot of our Acathian champs needed. I mean, like there were some champions that literally only had 3 lines written about them, and that was it. And they might have 7 lines of dialogue.
Right.
And so you kind of have to dig a little deeper with players, like what they've said is that about that champion, and kind of see how much of that we can find a home for in our world.
Right.
And then also some of the champions that were made at a very fast clip. So, you had a champion every 2 weeks.
Yeah.
How deep they dove into that archetype
Make a rock man.
might not have just gotten, they might have brushed the surface. So it's like, how can we potentially add more depth or give them a very specific home in our IP? Because we want to tell longer, bigger, better stories outside of League. I mean, a MOBA is not exactly the best way to experience narrative. So we want to make sure that like in other avenues that these characters have enough for writers and artists to kind of dig in and show the players that same love that they show us about those champions.
Greg, when we approach champion updates, I imagine also the DNA pillars kind of sometimes they have to be redone or rediscovered, especially for older champions. Otherwise you just have like Yordle and a mech as your foundation.
Right.
Where do we go from there? Is our approach different when it comes to champion reworks? Do we prioritize a specific pillar when it comes to selecting the ones?
I mean, it depends a lot on the magnitude of the change. Someone like Poppy almost felt like a new champion, right? It almost is the same process, the same kind of bandwidth it takes to develop that.
Scion as well.
Yeah, Scion's another great example. Warwick, on the other hand, Warwick was basically functional. He was a little too werewolfy and didn't really have our own narrative stamp on him.
Right.
And his gameplay was just a little too simplistic, but we didn't, where he was, the kind of players that played him, the kind of way you played him, we didn't want to dramatically change that. And I feel like that was a pretty successful update in that regard.
So champion updates are almost like you have the DNA, but then you also have a lot of pre-existing baggage that you either want to or don't want to bring in.
And some of that baggage is great.
That's the thing. Like, we don't even think about it as being baggage. I think when we talk about on the floor, it's things like, okay, Tarek. So people have a lot of ideas. Our players, look, the way they talk about Tarek, his fan art, the way people internally talk about Tarek. When you looked at him in the game, he just kind of looked like a blue crystal.
Right.
like a little human,
boobs.
like attached in like a little crystal.
So you have something growing on him.
But the idea of him being handsome and having flowing hair and all of these things were not necessarily represented anywhere, but we all knew that he had those things. Players knew he had those things, even though we were not representing those things.
Right.
So that is why I actually love the Champ Up space. I think they do some of the most fascinating work because they have to actually mine that out of the community. You really have to know League of Legends to work on that team.
Right.
You have to have a gut feeling for it. You also have to be listening to what players talk about and what resonates with them about a particular champion, no matter how old or unpopular or unplayed they are. Because when we do the rework, we consider all of that.
Right.
And that is why Tarek's rework looks the way it does. It's because of like what we felt was the essence of him, even though we had failed to actually represent that in his thematics.
Right. We'll create like these DNA pillars, and then players will be like, you know what, there's actually another pillar that we have gotten very attached to, like Master Yi's sword boots. I remember way, way back when we were visually updating, they're like, keep the sword boots. It's very important. And everyone's like, but why? Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
When you're going through the different, I'm going to pick one at random. What is the, when you're going through the different phases of designing a champion, do you ever go backwards in development? Greg, this is directed at you, but this is very interesting.
No, we definitely go backwards. I would say if you could think about the process overall as going down a road and you can veer to the left or veer to the right, or you come to forks sometimes.
Right.
And then you get down the fork and you're like, this is bad. We need to go back to the fork and go a different way. Like sometimes, particularly with the designed individual abilities, we get to the point where we just can't do it because maybe technically we can't do it. It would be a lot of engineering time. Or sometimes it's not fun, or the direction was off.
Yeah.
Aurelion Sol for a long time had an ability where he could just kind of like teleport to anywhere you want to go on the map, and that's kind of, and it was like at one point that was his ultimate. I think he had 4 charges, and after that, he couldn't do it anymore. Cool idea, but it was just not bearing fruit, and we just completely abandoned it and went a different direction.
Have we ever gotten so almost sidetracked that we've said we need to icebox this and just we'll come back in a couple of years? Narratively, narratively I feel like we are maybe not the most modular, but I can't help but wonder if that's the most capable of adjusting on the fly. Have we ever even hit
words
that?
are cheap, so we can throw them out.
Art's
art's expensive, design. But
Until we go to VO, and then it's not so
Then
cheap.
it's a good,
Yeah,
the
but
localization.
I think that every time like art or design kind of want to introduce a new thing, we're trying to, like, the job of narrative is to provide that thematic cohesion that makes it like, of course that's the way that it should
plausible.
be described. Plausible. Like, how does this work in the world? And I think that that's, so it requires just sometimes it's just a reflection of like, art's like, oh, I want to put, I want to make it a certain color. And so our questions usually in those meetings are why? Why do you want to make it a certain color? Oh, I want it to stand out. Okay, well, let's see, like, what does that choice do? Like, why would a person choose to do this? And for us, it's really digging into the character for that. For design, we want this person to feel like, better than you in lane. You want to feel sharp, like that's going to influence their personality, so each of those evolutions, hopefully they come in an earlier stage so that we can make sure that we help build a 3-dimensional character who feels like they're living and breathing and reflects those art and design pillars equally. But I think also we have to be flexible. I mean, game development is feedback and iteration. It's just a cycle of that until somebody says pencils down. It's time to
You abandon the
that's
what is it? You never finish a movie, you just abandon it. Same thing with a champion.
But I think having worked in different kinds of dev cycles, I love League for the fact that we do spend time going back. We have a champ update group. We ship things to players every 2 weeks, and when things are not right, we try to fix them. And I think that's an amazing, beautiful thing. As a player, I'm like, thank you. Like, you're just not going to leave me alone after 6 months. So, yeah.
Interesting. Has there actually ever been a champion that the narrative team has just been like, we don't know what to do here, and then make everyone pause? Or has it always just been, to your point, words are cheap, we can totally get this, we can not justify, but...
I think that, so our narrative discipline is made up of writers and editors from a lot of different fields. So we have screenwriters and TV writers and animation writers and game writers and prose writers, long form, fiction. And I think all of us kind of come with experiences about constructing character. So we lean on each other in writers' rooms where it's like, man, I just got pitched this idea. I'm not quite sure how to make it work. And in a writer's room, you're never trying to say no. So you're always trying to say, like, what are the possibilities? And usually with the help of others, which is another like game development thing, is like you can come to a good resolution on that and something you feel good about, or somebody can pose an idea that you'd never thought of before.
Right.
And those are the really exciting, like, electric times where you're like, if I had to do this just by myself, I would get discouraged and it would be not as fun.
Right.
But because I get to do this with other people who are also super passionate and excited about doing it, then it's
and they
exciting.
have a different perspective
Yeah,
too.
and it's exciting to come to work and you know, ping things
Yeah.
off of people and you know, that's the one thing I love about game development is because we are interdisciplined, because an artist will have a completely different frame of mind, a designer will have a different frame of mind coming to the same problem.
Right.
And it's like, how do we solve this together and make it look like it was just one person doing it?
I have a good example there. The writers are super flexible and they can kind of work with everything. But when we were developing Zion Rakan, and originally, I don't know if we've talked about this before, Kain was conceived of as the villain of that story. So it's going to be Zion Rakan and then their nemesis Kain.
Yeah.
And as we kind of pursued the story for the duo and then also the story for Kain, we're like, this is too much. Like, we're trying to tell too much story here, and nothing kind of gets room to breathe because we have to be like, oh, Kain, he's really complicated. Let me tell you about the Darkin thing.
Explain his
and all this.
backstory, and he's fighting them.
And so we decided just, okay, they're two separate stories. And then I felt like we were able to execute much better on both of them.
Oh, that's actually really cool. I do remember a little bit about the Kain epic, and then it kind of disappeared.
Originally, we were going to try to
He was
hint at
just-
Kain in the cinematic about Zion
He was
Rakan.
like their arch enemy.
Yeah,
he was
the
called
enemy.
Nemesis.
He was called
right?
Nemesis
That was
for
his
the longest
code
time.
word. Yeah.
It was
Yes.
Duo and Nemesis, and then there
New
were
Duo
like
Nemesis,
3
yeah.
champions.
Yeah, I remember that.
They
I
were
think
all-
that's the razor that we apply things again. So if the champion pillars for Zion Rakan are duo, and it's this kind of love story between the two of them and contrasting their personalities, then Kain kept feeling like a third wheel. And so that's the thing of just saying, like, don't don't force it. Like and we can say, does the Kain relationship to Zion Rakan make Zion Rakan a better champion in their first delivery to players?
Right.
And the answer to that was no. So we're like, let's cut it. But that doesn't mean that we can't sow some of those seeds to tell stories like that in the future, or have like imagine what it would be when they do meet. I mean, they do exist in Ionia. They might run into each other. So, but that's okay. But when we come to really cool things, like game development is also that pursuing of like shiny foil bits. It's like everybody in game development is like a raven. They just want to go and pick up all the like really cool flashy bits. And so you have to say, like, is this flashy bit going to actually make my champion, my character, my gameplay better?
Right.
Or is it just something that cool that I found? And if not, then you have to like put the cool thing down and just concentrate on building the best
Everyone
thing
dumping
you
all
can.
their candy into the stew.
Exactly.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. I should actually be calling out who's asking these questions. MSFCC asks, what comes first, the narrative story, abilities, and lore? You start with personality, character, look. Laura, I think you talked a little bit about how the DNA process has changed dramatically, almost like year over year with feedback. And so I'm kind of curious, do we just try to give it as much space where someone can come with like this strong idea regardless of where that comes, and that's now where we've come from?
I think we are in a place right now where if somebody comes with a strong idea, that the team will be open. I do feel like for the last few champions, though, it has been more design first. And I don't mean design is like running the show. And I mean, I'm sure Greg is
As it should.
yeah, exactly. But I think that there is like what we know is that when a champion is fun to play, it's great for players. So when the kit is solid and it's really fun. And there's a great mastery curve that this is awesome for our players. So I think that when there's a kit that feels like it's coming together and it's coming to life, I think that's a great place for the thematics to come in and start to build on that. And so I think that lately, I feel like it's been more design leading, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're calling all the shots. It means that they're inspiring all the thematics, and that would be the narrative and the audio and the visuals is how all these things come together.
Right.
I think in a world where we have as many champions as we do, and they each have their own unique gameplay, trying to figure out how to introduce new gameplay and keeping all of that balanced is actually like you want to start with the hardest question. And I think that in a world where like thematics and art, like I think can be a little bit more flexible in exploring even different avenues of a similar archetype. Like we have many mages in our game, and I think that we can feel good about exploring different aspects of what it means to be a mage.
Yeah.
But if the fundamental gameplay isn't new or novel or like
it's gotta be fun.
Well, and also it doesn't destroy the game or however that interpretation is. It needs to be good. So we want to make sure that they feel like they're pursuing a great idea, and then we can help support them, and then it becomes that evolution altogether. But in terms of like the question, I think we start with personality, and then start to ask the questions of why is that person that way, and like where does that personality best fit in the world, to start building out those lore and backstory kind of questions.
Right. We'll take. I think this will be our last question from. Goodbye, everyone. Destroy the game. Nice. I'm now reading Twitch chat. GGLA Wapa says, can you generally see which champions will become the most popular? Have you been surprised by any champions' popularity or lack thereof? I would add like maybe another one of, sometimes we design for DNA and we have our core pillars. Have we seen times when a champion has picked up like an entirely different attribute or a core thematic that we're like, wow, they think that this character is all about X, Y, Z?
So we try to call our shots here, and we try to make sure we have, it's okay to have champions that are broad, meaning lots and lots of people play them, like Ashe and Lux are good examples there. And it's also okay to have champions that are deep, meaning they may not appeal to everyone, but the players that love them and play hundreds of games on them.
Zoey's.
Yeah,
Bard.
and she'll probably be.
Bard.
Yeah.
Oh, Bard, yeah.
It's not okay to have a champion that nobody plays. That's kind of in the fourth, the quadrant. We don't like champions there.
Urgot, old Urgot.
Old Urgot. And when we redesigned Urgot, we knew Urgot was never going to be we didn't want Urgot to be a highly broadly played champion.
Yeah.
But we wanted to make sure that there were Urgot mains who really got the champion and felt like, this is my new main.
Yeah, the gross.
Yeah. I'm trying to think of examples where we thought, yeah, this one is going to be super popular, and then we just missed the boat on, or other, like, I think Jin is maybe an example of, we thought he was going to be a little more niche because he's kind of a weird dude.
He's very fun,
literally a
though.
psychopath.
Yeah.
But
Sociopath.
I think that
Sociopath.
I think some
Good
players.
clarification.
Get
The
those
narrative,
straight.
the writer
Get it right,
clarifies.
get it right.
All right,
There's a
cool,
difference.
cool,
There's a
cool.
difference,
Okay,
yeah.
I was just going to say, I think that for some players that is appealing, and for others, his gameplay is so good that they play him despite whether
His
or not
kit
they're.
is one of my favorites as an ADC. Has there any been one? I guess actually that was your example of like one that we thought was going to underperform and ended up just being like super resonant.
And again, it's not about perform. I mean, it's,
Sure.
yeah.
Sorry. Yeah.
I'm trying to think. Can you guys think of an example of one where like, yeah, this one's gonna be really popular? And it
I
just
feel like I can think of
didn't
one
go
where,
there?
I felt like Aurelion Sol was that. Because I thought that, we heard a lot from our from players about wanting the dragon and tried to make the dragon, then we shelved the dragon and we went back to the dragon. And I think that there was an expectation for him to have a further reach than he had. I don't know if I'm remembering that correctly, but
It's also crazy hard to play.
His
yeah, he's
game
hard
is
to play.
Very high skill. Yeah.
He's hard to play, but like his thematics-wise, we were really happy with where he landed. He was very beautiful, and I think that we had an idea in our head that he would have a broader appeal because of those thematics. But in fact, again, it's how it all comes together. It's like the visual thematics and the gameplay. It's like he's more niche.
That's interesting. The things that we see that drive character resonance sometimes, if to your point, if like the character is very fun, then they'll often overcome sometimes like really weird traits like being a sociopath. But then also we've seen like if it's like just a really gorgeous, very well put together character in terms of thematics, then we actually but the kit is really off. I guess Aurelion Sol is actually a good example of this. I'm curious if we have any other champions that are like, to your point, we were like, this is great, this hits everything, and we think it's going to be great, and then maybe kit-wise they don't. Is that where actually we step in almost with a champion update?
I can think of it. Nar is an interesting example there, where maybe the thematic and the gameplay don't quite match, and because he's kind of a cute champion, you might think he'd really broadly appeal. But his gameplay is actually kind of challenging to get there, and it's not for everyone.
Right.
So maybe he's a mismatch.
Interesting. Okay. Is that my conclusion? That's my conclusion. I have a concluding thing up here as part of my script, but I don't have it. Did I read it? It was just one sentence. Yeah, that's what it is. We sadly need to bring this session to a close. If you didn't get your question answered, please do feel free to tweet us afterwards at Riot Games. Greg has a Tumblr, Ghost Crawler.
Thank you.
That's it. But now thank you, Ariel, Laura, and Greg.
You're welcome.
And thank you for watching.
Thanks, guys.
Goodbye,
Always a pleasure.
stream. Yeah.